I'm not having any luck on this trip. I need a break. That's when I spotted the Moto Scoot. Ooh, this is cool.
The Moto Scoot is a very rare scooter.
How about $850? I mean, I see a lot of things here I don't know if you're doing anything with. I'll do $1,000 on it.
The saddest part of Frank Fritz's story happened after the cameras stopped rolling. By then, his health was failing, friendships had fallen apart, legal battles were unfolding, and the life millions thought they knew had become almost unrecognizable. Behind the headlines was a story far more painful than most fans ever realized. So what really happened to Frank Fritz after he left American Pickers? And how did one of reality television's most beloved stars end up facing such a heartbreaking final chapter? Join us as we uncover the full story. The quiet exit nobody saw coming. In 2020, American Pickers fans noticed something was off. Frank Fritz, who had been on screen alongside Mike Wolfe since the show's premiere in 2010, simply was not appearing in new episodes anymore. Frank had stepped away from filming to undergo back surgery, having dealt with years of debilitating pain that was caused by lifting heavy objects throughout his career as a picker. The pain had become so severe that doctors discovered his spine was, in his own words, about to split in half. Surgeons placed 2 rods up the middle of his spine and closed the procedure with 185 stitches. It was a major operation, the kind that requires real recovery time, and most fans assumed Frank would simply return once he had healed. That return that fans expected never came. Fritz was officially fired from American Pickers right before the filming of Season 22 in July 2021, amid rising tensions between him and his longtime co-host, Mike Wolfe. The decision was confirmed publicly by Mike himself on Instagram, in a post that tried to honor more than a decade of partnership while making clear that Frank would not be coming back. He wrote that he had known Frank for as long as he could remember, that Frank had been like a brother to him, and that the journey the two of them had started back in 2009 had come with its highs and lows, its blessings and its challenges, but had also been the most rewarding experience of his life. The warmth in that statement sat uneasily next to the reality underneath it, because by the time that post went up, Frank and Mike had not spoken in years. In a 2021 interview with the U.S. Sun, Frank revealed the full extent of the rift. He said he had not talked to Mike in 2 years. He said Mike knew his back was messed up, but had never called to ask how he was doing. He said that was just how it was. For 2 men who had spent over a decade traveling the country together, sleeping in cheap motels, arguing over the value of rusted bicycles, and building one of the most beloved partnerships in reality television history. That silence was its own kind of heartbreak, separate entirely from anything that played out on camera. What had actually caused the breakdown between them was never fully explained in public. But Frank offered his own theory about where things had gone wrong, one that revealed something he had clearly been carrying for a long time. So what did Frank Fritz actually believe was happening behind the scenes that pushed him out of the show he had helped build? The frontman and the friction nobody wanted to talk about. For years, casual viewers of American Pickers experienced the show as a genuine partnership between 2 equals. While Mike found the bigger, flashier finds, Frank found the smaller, quirkier ones. Together they negotiated, they bickered, they laughed, and the chemistry between them was part of what made the show one of the most consistently popular programs on the History Channel for over a decade. Frank Fritz saw it differently, at least by the time he was being pushed out the door. He compared the dynamic to a famous rock band, saying it was like having Aerosmith, with Steven Tyler as the frontman. He said he had found his spot, that he was second and Mike was number 1 on the show, and that he had no problem with that arrangement. He added, somewhat pointedly, that maybe Mike was the one who had a problem. The comparison was self-deprecating on the surface, but underneath it sat a real accusation. that the show had become tilted toward Mike in a way Frank felt was unfair, and that something about his absence during recovery had made that imbalance worse rather than better. Fritz went further, suggesting that he believed Mike wanted to bring in his own brother, Robbie Wolf, to replace him on the show. He said he did not know why Mike was behaving that way toward him. Whatever the truth of that suspicion, the outcome confirmed at least part of what Frank had feared. Robbie Wolf did eventually become part of the show's cast in the years that followed Frank's departure. Frank felt sidelined while he was genuinely struggling with his health. Mike, for reasons that have never been fully detailed publicly, did not reach out during that period in the way Frank needed him to. What happened next, though, would force both men to confront everything that had built up between them, not through a conversation, but through a medical emergency that nearly killed Frank entirely. So what actually happened inside that Davenport, Iowa home that turned a quiet professional falling out into something far more serious? The stroke that changed everything. On July 14, 2022, Frank Fritz was found unresponsive inside his home in Davenport, Iowa. He was rushed to a local hospital where doctors determined he had suffered a stroke. The man who had spent over a decade traveling the country, hauling heavy antiques out of barns and basements, who had described himself as still in top-notch shape despite years of back pain, was now lying in a hospital bed, his body having been struck by something far more devastating than any injury he had sustained on the job. The stroke left him partially paralyzed, with the entire right side of his body affected. He had to be checked into an assisted living facility and began undergoing extensive physical therapy. He had to relearn basic physical tasks, with friends reporting that he could eventually walk again, though the motion on his right side remained compromised, and he continued to depend on a wheelchair because he could not stand for extended periods. The stroke had affected his speech significantly as well, stripping away one of the very qualities that had made him so beloved on screen in the first place. The easy, friendly banter that had defined a decade of television appearances was no longer something Frank could simply call up the way he once had. The medical crisis exposed something that the public had not fully understood about Frank's situation in the years since his exit from the show. Close friend Chris Davis filed for an emergency appointment of temporary conservatorship because the stroke had so severely impaired Frank's decision-making capacity that he could no longer manage his own care or finances. Court documents stated plainly that because of his stroke, Mr. Fritz's decision-making capacity was so impaired that he was unable to care for his own safety or provide for necessities such as food, shelter, clothing, or medical care without which physical injury or illness might occur. A conservatorship and guardianship were established in August 2022, just weeks after the stroke. Midwest One Bank took over responsibility for managing his finances. A wheelchair ramp was installed at his Iowa home as part of the adjustments made to accommodate his new reality. A man who had once been celebrated nationally for his expertise picking apart estate sales now had his own estate, his own daily existence placed under the legal management of a bank and a court-appointed conservator. The severity of the situation reached Mike Wolf almost immediately, and what he chose to say publicly suggested that whatever had broken between the two men was suddenly, urgently, beside the point. So how did the man who had not spoken to Frank in years respond once he learned that his former partner might not survive? The reunion that came almost too late. Within days of the stroke becoming public knowledge, Mike Wolf posted on Instagram acknowledging directly that there had been a lot of opinions about his and Frank's friendship and about the show, but that now was not the time to set the record straight. Now, he wrote, was the time to pray for his friend. He went further, writing directly to Frank, "I pray more than anything that you make it through this okay. I love you, buddy. That post marked a clear turning point, though it would still be nearly a year before the two men actually saw each other face to face. In May 2023, over Memorial Day weekend, Frank and Mike finally reunited in person. Arrangements made possible by a mutual friend, after Frank himself reportedly expressed that he wanted to see Mike. A friend close to the situation told the Quad City Times that both men were in tears during the reunion. Frank's health, despite that emotional reunion, did not meaningfully improve in the way everyone close to him had hoped. The stroke had done lasting damage, and what followed was not a recovery story, but a slow, difficult decline that would stretch across the next 2 years of his life. So, what was actually happening to Frank during that period, away from the cameras and away from public view, as he tried to rebuild some version of a life inside a body that no longer fully obeyed him? The years the public never really saw. After the initial wave of coverage around his stroke faded, Frank Fritz largely disappeared from public attention, living out his recovery quietly in his Davenport, Iowa home under the management of his conservatorship. By July 2024, conservator Midwest One Bank determined that Frank required skilled and long-term nursing care and demanded that his finances be transferred accordingly to cover those needs. 2 years after his stroke, Frank had not recovered to a point where he could live independently. If anything, the language used in the legal filings suggested his condition required an even higher level of care than what had been initially arranged. Throughout this entire period, American Pickers kept airing without him. The show continued into its 27th season, with Mike Wolfe leading it alongside other cast members, while Frank had not appeared on screen since season 21 back in 2020. For longtime fans, there was something quietly painful about watching new episodes continue to be produced and broadcast, the familiar theme music playing, Mike still combing through barns and warehouses, while the man who had spent 10 years sitting right beside him doing the exact same thing sat alone in a wheelchair 4 states away, watching, if he was able to watch at all, a show that had simply moved on without him. Frank's underlying health problems went well beyond the stroke itself. He had lived with Crohn's disease, a chronic inflammatory bowel condition, for 36 years. He described the condition vividly in a 2021 interview, saying there was no cure, that it was like a dragon, and that every day was a crapshoot. One day, he said, he could eat a double chimichanga with hot sauce pouring out of it and have no problem at all. The next day, a piece of toast with some scrambled eggs could trigger a serious flare-up. That unpredictability had been part of his daily reality for decades before the stroke ever entered the picture. Layered now on top of paralysis, impaired speech, and a body that required constant, supervised care. In that same 2021 interview, Frank had also revealed something else that complicated the picture of his final years considerably. He had entered a rehab facility to address a drinking problem. The combination of chronic illness, substance struggles, professional rejection, and the collapse of a defining friendship had clearly taken a toll on Frank well before the stroke arrived to compound everything further. He had, in his own words from that same period, expressed genuine hope of getting back to his job as co-host. That hope never materialized. The back surgery that was supposed to be a temporary detour became a permanent exit, and the stroke that followed a year later made any possibility of return effectively impossible. And then, in September 2024, the slow decline that had been unfolding quietly for 2 years reached its inevitable conclusion. So, what were the final days actually like for Frank Fritz? And how did the people who loved him choose to say goodbye? The end, and the goodbye that followed. Frank Fritz died on September 30th 2024, at the age of 60, in a hospice facility in the Midwest. According to his death certificate, his official cause of death was listed as late sequela of cerebral infarction, medical terminology for complications arising from the stroke he had suffered more than 2 years earlier. The certificate noted that the fatal event was the result of cerebral vascular disease, a condition affecting blood flow and blood vessels in the brain. The coroner also identified aortic stenosis, a chronic heart valve condition, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, an ongoing lung condition, as contributing factors that played a role in his death. Frank died surrounded by friends, including Mike Wolfe, who was present with him at the hospice facility in his final days. Whatever distance had once existed between the two men, whatever silence had stretched across those 2 years when Frank felt abandoned during his back surgery recovery, none of it remained by the time the end actually came. Mike was there. The reconciliation that had begun in tears over Memorial Day weekend in 2023 had clearly held, carrying the two men through the final and hardest stretch of Frank's life. When the show's new season premiered shortly after Frank's death, Mike dedicated it directly to his memory, writing that it had taken him a long time to figure out what he wanted to say, or whether he even wanted to post that new episodes were starting. He acknowledged that they had been making the show without Frank for 4 years by that point, but said they had always wanted him back with the crew, and that health issues had simply made that impossible. He wrote that every time he and the crew were in Iowa, they would go and sit by Frank's side, letting him know how much he was missed and how he could never be replaced. For all the public drama around the firing, the years of silence and the conservatorship, Mike Wolfe and the production crew had apparently been visiting Frank in Iowa throughout those final years, not performing reconciliation for cameras, but showing up in private, sitting with a man whose voice had been taken from him by a stroke, making sure he knew he was not forgotten, even as the show that had made him famous moved forward without him. What remained after Frank's death, though, was not simply grief. It became, almost immediately, a legal dispute that revealed just how complicated his final years had genuinely been. What actually happened to everything Frank Fritz left behind? And why did even his own will become a source of conflict just months after he was buried? The fight over what Frank left behind. Frank Fritz's estate was estimated at approximately $6 million at the time of his death, a figure built from over a decade of television income, his personal motorcycle collection, and an antiques business he had run independently of the show. According to reporting from the U.S. Sun, Frank's lawyer had filed what was called a will prior to death in October 2023, intended to keep the document while Frank was still alive and under conservatorship. A certificate approving that will was issued on October 18, 2024, just weeks after Frank's passing. For a brief period, it appeared the legal matters surrounding his death would be settled relatively cleanly. That settlement did not hold. On December 30, 2024, an attorney representing a friend of Frank's entered an appearance in the probate case on her behalf. Then, on February 3, 2025, a separate attorney filed a petition specifically requesting that the will be set aside, along with a jury demand, a formal legal request asking the court to invalidate the document Frank had signed and approved before his death. The dispute raised uncomfortable questions that anyone who had followed Frank's final years could probably have anticipated. He had spent more than 2 years living under a conservatorship specifically because a stroke had been determined to impair his decision-making capacity to the point that he could not be trusted to manage his own affairs. A will signed and approved during that same period, while he was navigating impaired speech, partial paralysis, and the daily management of a court-appointed bank conservator, was always going to be vulnerable to exactly the kind of legal challenge that eventually arrived. Whether the will accurately reflected Frank's genuine wishes, made with whatever clarity remained available to him, or whether it had been shaped by people positioned closer to him during a period of profound vulnerability, became a question for the courts to untangle long after Frank himself was no longer present to clarify any of it. That final legal battle, playing out in an Iowa probate court months after his death, feels like a fitting and deeply sad bookend to everything Frank Fritz experienced in his last years. A man who had spent his career as a professional negotiator ended his own life leaving behind a $6 million estate that other people would now have to fight over, with Frank himself having no voice left in the outcome. What do you think really caused the rift between Frank and Mike in those first years after his back surgery? And do you think their reconciliation came in time? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.